It was an announcement that made it seem, even for the briefest of moments, as if one of the world's most devastated conflict zones might finally get a respite.
Israel saying it's withdrawing ground troops from southern Gaza.
On Sunday, April 7th, the Israeli Defense Forces, or IDF, announced that it had withdrawn its troops from the city of Khan Yunis in the southern part of the Palestinian enclave of Gaza. But in our lead story today, we're not going to be reporting on a surprise move toward de-escalation, let alone peace. Instead, we're going to report on the Israeli announcement that came after. Israel will be invading the Gazan city of Rafah at a yet unspecified date that is, by all accounts, imminent. The withdrawal came as a somewhat predictable but unexpectedly large step in a continued process of Israeli troop drawdown in Gaza. Since the start of this year, Israel has pulled handfuls of IDF troops out at a time in order to provide some respite for reserve troops who can then cycle out of combat. But the Sunday the 7th drawdown left only one brigade in southern Gaza to keep control of the enclave. That's anywhere between 2,000 and 4,000 troops, depending on the particular brigade that was chosen to remain. A lot of the precise figures on just how many troops left and how many stayed is as yet unknown. When they were pulled out, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant specified that the withdrawn troops would be moving to prepare for future operations in Gaza, while anonymous Israeli officials reported that the brigade left in southern Gaza would continue carrying out directed operations against Hamas targets. But at that moment, without a clear next destination for the troops or even a concrete idea of what orders they had been given, there was a brief, fleeting hope that the withdrawal could signal a dramatic reduction in hostilities. As for why such an outcome was even considered plausible, well, there were a few good reasons. As we discussed in our last installment of the Situation Room, Israel has endured withering rounds of global condemnation for its war in Gaza after airstrikes on a humanitarian convoy belonging to the food aid organization World Central Kitchen left 7 aid workers dead. Most of the dead were foreigners, hailing from some of the countries that give Israel its strongest backing, and details of the convoy strike, like how the convoy had been hit multiple times despite being clearly visibly marked with World Central Kitchen labels meant to be seen from the air, have only exacerbated the outrage further. Pressure on Israel from its biggest supporters, particularly the United States, has increased exponentially after months when Israel seemed to have all the approval it needed to act with impunity. Not only that, but both Israel and the Hamas organization had confirmed that they'd be sending delegations to Egypt in a new round of talks to work towards a potential ceasefire. Add the troop withdrawal to the international pressure and throw in a new round of ceasefire discussions, and things were looking fairly decent for the first time in a long time. But very quickly, after the withdrawal announcement came, it was followed with news that left far less room for optimism. According to IDF Chief and Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi, the move wasn't so much a drawdown in troop deployment numbers as it was a chance to pivot into the next phase of hostilities. The coming offensive was to be directed at the city of Rafah, a place where a large proportion of Gaza's civilian population have taken refuge, but where Israel claims that the Hamas organization still maintains one final stronghold. 2 days after the withdrawal, on Tuesday the 9th, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced that he had set a date for the Rafah offensive, although at the time of writing, he and the rest of the Israeli government have not announced that date to the public. Despite Netanyahu and his government insisting for weeks that an invasion of Rafah is necessary to complete the IDF's mission against Hamas, the prospect has still drawn warnings from international governments and aid organizations. Present, well over 1 million Palestinians are trying to seek shelter in the city, nearly all of whom only came to Rafah at all because they were driven from their own homes by the last 6 months of war. Some 600,000 children are believed to be among their number.
It would be utterly catastrophic to have a military incursion into Rafah, the one place people were told to go.
In Rafah, they live in tents and dense refugee camps, and with Gaza's border with Egypt sealed shut and the rest of Gaza under IDF control, a Rafah invasion will leave that same displaced population with nowhere to go and no choice but to be caught in the crossfire. Those fears were confirmed over the course of the last few days as Gazans have attempted to return to the city of Khan Yunis now that the IDF has withdrawn, but there they've only found ruin, with half of the city's buildings reduced to rubble and even basic civil infrastructure completely destroyed. International experts have warned that there are likely thousands of unexploded munitions in the wreckage of the city, with the clear potential to kill people trying to rebuild. In past changes to their offensive, the IDF has attempted to shift displaced civilians from place to place, putting them in one area while fighting is contained in another. But to do that by sending over 1 million people to Khan Yunis all but guarantees that those people will be forced to make do with nothing while navigating what amounts to a minefield, even as the humanitarian situation across Gaza gets even more dire. Despite all the potential ruin of a Rafah invasion, Netanyahu remains committed to the idea of a full-scale assault. In Rafah, Netanyahu claims are surviving Hamas combat units which must be hunted down and destroyed before a lasting peace becomes feasible. Said Netanyahu speaking to new IDF recruits at an Israeli military base, quoting here, "We will complete the elimination of Hamas's battalions, including in Rafah. No force in the world will stop us. There are many forces trying to do this, but it will not help, because this enemy, after what it has done, will not do this again." But even here, Netanyahu has been contradicted by his own top officials. Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, speaking to American Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin on Monday the 8th, has claimed that Gallant has not been informed of any hard date for a Rafah invasion. US officials have confirmed that they too have no direct confirmation of an ETA, despite Israel's broad tendency to alert America about this sort of thing before it happens. In one somewhat more positive sign, Gallant has specified that so far as he's concerned, an orderly evacuation of civilians in Rafah, plus the shipment of increased humanitarian aid, would be a prerequisite before any large-scale offensive. In other arenas within Israeli strategic leadership, America's new pressure campaign appears to be having at least some positive impact. Perhaps in an attempt to appease the US, Israel made an announcement while negotiations were ongoing, stating that over 400 aid trucks, including 330 with food on board, had entered Gaza on Monday the 8th, a figure well past double the daily average of trucks in the month of March. That's still not enough, and it's certainly not enough to alleviate the critical hunger in northern Gaza, but it is something. Meanwhile, talks in the Egyptian capital city of Cairo are ongoing in hopes of finally securing the ceasefire that's been elusive for so long. Defense Minister Gallant suggested just days ago that now is the time to strike a deal, and yes, that is the same guy that we just cited as saying that the troops withdrawn from southern Gaza would be reoriented toward upcoming combat operations. As has been the case for a long time, each side has included among its demands specific items that it knows the other side considers to be a non-starter. But senior Hamas officials speaking to Reuters have indicated that they're willing to examine Israel's proposals. According to Israeli media, the country's delegation has been given a, quote, expanded mandate to operate during the talks, and Israel's intelligence chiefs are expected to be present there to help wield the delegation's influence. The director of the American CIA, William Burns, is also on scene in Cairo, a living representation of the pressure that the US is now working to exert on Israel to bring about some sort of resolution. But even that may not be enough to get Israel to look past what Hamas claims to be the realities on the ground. According to American political outlet The Hill, Hamas has informed negotiators that it doesn't have 40 hostages that could be released to Israel, suggesting that if the source in question isn't lying, then many more of the hostages may have already died than Israel has publicly claimed. According to the same article, CIA Director Burns has suggested the release of 40 hostages in exchange for Israel releasing Palestinian prisoners from its jails. At present, the countries mediating the negotiations, Egypt and Qatar, seem to believe that a compromise can still be found, but what that will look like is as yet unclear. And finally, there's one more element of this situation to consider, namely Israel's apparent war posture along its border with Lebanon, where the Hamas-allied Iran-backed militant organization Hezbollah has traded fire almost daily now with Israel for months. In last week's installment of The Situation Room, we covered brazen airstrikes attributed to Israel, one of which killed several senior Iranian generals on Iran's embassy compound in Damascus, Syria, and others which killed high-level Hezbollah officials. This week, strikes against Hezbollah targets have continued, and on Sunday, April 7th, the same day that Israel pulled out of southern Gaza, it announced that it had reached a new phase of war preparedness along its northern border. Said the IDF about their preparedness drive, quoting here, "The commanders of the regular and reserve units are prepared to summon and equip all the required soldiers in just a few hours and transport them to the front line for defensive and offensive missions." In other words, Israel is now ready to go to war in Lebanon at a moment's notice, raising a specter of a regional escalation that could draw in the internationally recognized Lebanese government, the Iran-backed nation of Syria, or even Iran itself, depending on how badly the whole situation spirals out of control. At the center of Israel's entire posture in this war is the mess of difficult realities that Netanyahu himself has had to reconcile. 6 months into Israel's sweeping counteroffensive against Hamas, Netanyahu's popularity in Israel has taken a nosedive from a pre-war environment that didn't view him too fondly to begin with. Anti-government protests have been growing inside Israel, from citizens outraged at what they see as the government's inaction in trying to free the 130 or so hostages estimated to still remain in Gaza, of whom up to a quarter are believed to be already dead. Among their demands is a ceasefire and a prisoner swap or a release deal with Hamas. At the same time, Israel's far right, which Netanyahu depends on for political support, is demanding a large-scale attack on Rafah and a complete policy against making any concessions to Hamas. Netanyahu's most important international supporter, American President Joe Biden, has gotten far sharper in his criticism of the Israeli PM, calling his war policy, quoting here, a mistake, and demanding a ceasefire in the aftermath of Israel's strike against the World Central Kitchen convoy, quoting Biden again here, I think it's outrageous that those 3 vehicles were hit by drones and taken out on a highway. What I'm calling for is the Israelis to just call for a ceasefire, allow the next 6-8 weeks total access to all food and medicine going into the country. Days ago, Egypt, France, and Jordan released a joint statement to advocate against an offensive in Rafah, while pressures from the United Nations, World Central Kitchen, the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, and a range of other humanitarian organizations is focused singularly toward establishing a policy to alleviate the growing starvation across Gaza. And from all corners at once, suspicion is still rising that Netanyahu's decision to continue Israel's offensive in Gaza is much more about his own political survival than it is about freeing hostages, dismantling Hamas, or anything else. Right now, Benjamin Netanyahu is caught between a rock and a hard place, and when we take all of Israel's recent actions together, we begin to see traces of what his endgame might be. Combine the renewed efforts towards a ceasefire, the removal of troops from southern Gaza, the decision to raise the specter of an imminent Rafah offensive, the posturing to the north, and Israel's willingness to target Iranian allies and Iran itself well outside of the confines of Gaza, and the situation fundamentally does not suggest that Netanyahu and his government are rudderless in this moment. Instead, and please do bear with us here for a bit of orographics analysis, the Israeli government appears to be posturing, threatening, shifting around troops, and increasing diplomatic pressure, all to set up a situation that grants them the best possible leverage to negotiate favorable terms in a ceasefire agreement and secure something that the Netanyahu government can hold up as a win. Secure a ceasefire, and Israel may get quite a few of its hostages back, gain time to process civilians as they leave Rafah, and still have the option to pursue a military offensive when an eventual ceasefire runs out. Why? Because if a ceasefire doesn't happen, then the Rafah offensive that nobody around the world wants will begin imminently, with far less time to evacuate or spare civilians, and when the violence kicks back up again, it may end up being far more than just Gaza that finds itself in the IDF crosshairs. Option A sees a long pause to the violence, a large-scale humanitarian relief effort, and a chance for Netanyahu to appease many of his critics, while still keeping the far-right allies that he needs as they wait for an opportunity to launch a future offensive. In option B, the world watches a worst-case scenario play out in Rafah and might just watch a broader regional war erupt too. Present a choice between those two futures, and Israel wouldn't be incorrect in supposing that the world would have a vested interest in securing one outcome and avoiding the other. And in our next story today, we travel to the nation of Somalia, a place that is quite frankly becoming an all-too-common fixture here in our weekly special episode. This time, though, the situation facing Somalia is less a single destructive event and more a full breakdown on a national level. The current rounds of chaos kicked off not this past Sunday, but the Sunday prior, when on March the 31st, Somalia's semi-autonomous state of Puntland announced that it had unilaterally withdrawn itself from Somalia's federal system. According to Puntland, the territory will instead govern itself fully independently without input from the Somali capital of Mogadishu. The issue at hand is a set of new constitutional changes that recently passed through Somalia's federal parliament, changing the country's presidential elections from its traditionally indirect clan-run process to a direct election using a nationwide popular vote. Also in the legislative package was a measure to allow presidents to appoint prime ministers without the approval of parliament. Now, we'll get to just why that legislation matters so much to Puntland in just a minute, but before we do, we've first got to step back and view Somalia as a whole. Puntland is, officially, one of 7 federal member states that make up Somaliland. It's located on the tip of the African Horn, where Somalia sort of juts out into the Indian Ocean, and it's held semi-autonomous status since about 1998. But Puntland isn't the only federal state that's been less than friendly to Somali control. The northwest province of Somaliland has been fully self-governing and has declared itself to be independent for decades. Somaliland very recently had its independence claims recognized by the nearby, landlocked and relatively powerful nation of Ethiopia, where that country's leader, a man named Abiy Ahmed, would very much like to have a port that Somaliland can give him. Also, within Somalia, the militant terror and ethno-nationalist organization known as Al-Shabaab controls large amounts of territory in its own right, roving across the landscape and leaving a trail of bodies in its wake. The Somali government in Mogadishu, to the extent that it exists at all, is quite weak, with endemic corruption issues, a military that's mostly non-functional, and a near-complete dependency on foreign aid and support to prop itself up. Somali piracy is back on the high seas, and a drought across the region has left millions of people hungry with little food in sight. So for Somalia to get this latest slap in the face and have it come not from any of the Somali government's well-established internal adversaries, but from a place that otherwise doesn't tend to cause issues, was a pretty massive problem. For Puntland, the issue is predominantly one to do with Somalia's unique and very pervasive structure of powerful clans, which has been the basis for Somalia's old system of presidential elections. Leave a presidential election in the hands of the people by way of a popular vote, and larger clans are more likely to have their will respected. The Darod clan, which makes up most of Puntland, would likely have a very hard time making its voice heard on a national level. And in the event that the president were allowed to choose a prime minister unilaterally, more distant and less Mogadishu-dependent places like Puntland could very quickly see their peace upended. A new set of national executives having nothing to do with Puntland and zero reason to protect it could very easily make the semi-autonomous region into a bogeyman or use pressure and force it to reintegrate politically and economically with the rest of Somalia. Said Puntland's own information minister Mahmoud Adi Duria, "We are a fragile country still recovering from a civil war which doesn't have stable politics. If power is concentrated in one person's hands, there is a risk we could go back to civil war. We have always warned that this could happen." For the time being, Puntland has resolved to self-administer until a roundly agreeable Somali constitution can be settled upon and ratified via public referendum. For Puntland itself, that really shouldn't be an issue. The territory is more than capable of governing semi-autonomously and has been for some time. But for Somalia, Puntland's decision is yet another blow to Mogadishu's claim to authority inside the country, and it comes at exactly the wrong time. Mogadishu's effort to implement a popular vote system came about because of a few different reasons, but chief among them was the deeply flawed nature of Somalia's current clan-based system. Sure, it forces Somalia's clans to work with each other, but it also creates a much worse version of the same sort of problems that, say, the United States faces with its electoral college. In Somalia, the system is easily exploited by the clans, and it allows for groups like Al-Shabaab to rise up and become powerful without being checked. Not only that, but at a time when Mogadishu is doing everything it can to ensure that it remains the global voice on all matters Somalia, implementing a more traditionally Western voting system is a valuable offering to backers in the US and Europe. This newest roadblock has only exacerbated a situation in which the Somali government has a whole lot to be pissed off about, but lacks the strength or the diplomatic power to fix a single one of its problems. And unlike Al-Shabaab, which is far too strong for most of the Somali military to take on, or Somaliland, which now lives under the dual protection of Ethiopia and the UAE, Puntland didn't even do anything where Somalia could attempt to save face with a show of military force. The entire situation, on top of Mogadishu's other myriad headaches, has left the national government grasping at straws and searching for ways to remind its wayward member states who is boss. To that end, Somalia made yet more news on the 4th of April when it announced via press release that it was booting representatives of nearby Ethiopia out of the country. According to Mogadishu, its own ambassador would return from Ethiopia, while the Ethiopian ambassador had to leave Somalia in 72 hours. Ethiopia's consulates in both Puntland and Somaliland would be closed as penalty for Somaliland's long flirtation with the neighboring country and Puntland's decision to send a delegation to the Ethiopian capital of Addis Ababa to take part in conversations around Ethiopia's need for port access. In the face of Mogadishu's decision, Puntland authorities have reiterated that they aren't declaring independence or seceding from Somalia, but are instead handling their own internal affairs for a while. As of now, Mogadishu's decision remains unchanged. If one thing is clear in all of this, it's that Somalia has long since lost its ability to draw real lines in the sand. While the country's central and southern provinces are at least relatively under control, Al-Shabaab insurgency notwithstanding, it's got no mechanism to assert itself in Puntland, Somalia's richest region, or Somaliland, where at this point 3 decades of self-rule have meant that the local government is well practiced in shrugging off Mogadishu's influence. And as infuriating as Ethiopia's influence might be for Somali President Hassan Sheikh Mahmoud, it's not likely that Mogadishu is about to square up to Addis Ababa and attempt to settle the issue by force. Somalia is widely considered to be the militarily inferior power with a deeply corrupt military whose only useful element, a brigade of commandos called Danab that we've recently made an episode about, is not equipped to fight and win an international war. Somalia tried to threaten war earlier this year when Ethiopia first agreed to its deal with Somaliland, but considering that Somalia can't even fight its current war with al-Shabaab without major Western support, it's not likely Somalia could go toe-to-toe with Ethiopia, Somaliland, and Puntland while still fighting al-Shabaab and having its Western support dry up because it went and started a war of aggression without cause. In fact, it's worth asking what Somalia would have done if Ethiopia's consulates in Somaliland and Puntland just stayed open. After all, it's not like Somalia has the means to go into either territory and assert its will by force, and certainly not without kicking off a broader conflict, losing support from the West, and setting Somalia down the path to yet another civil war. To that end, both Somalia and Puntland have stated that Mogadishu's edicts won't be respected, although at the time of writing, the deadline for Ethiopia to stay or go has not yet passed. If one thing is clear in Somalia, it's that the internationally recognized government there is very quickly turning into a technicality rather than a true authority. Two of its provinces run roughshod over its claims of governing power, its next-door neighbor hardly even pretends to respect its place in the international order, and its backers around the world are forced to watch as the people they supported to lead Somalia aren't just exposed as emperors with no clothes, but are left powerless and unable to even cover up what's been revealed. All the while, al-Shabaab gets to have a field day with the public discontent that Ethiopia, Somalia, Puntland, and Somaliland work together to create, leaving more people disenfranchised and searching for answers in a journey that frequently leads them into the clutches of Somalia's most violent entity. How long Somalia can survive like this, it's tough to say with precision, but it certainly can't stay on this path for long if it's going to have any chance at survival. And next up, we travel to the thawing, mud-caked battlefields of Ukraine, where the United Nations Atomic Watchdog Agency, the International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA, has strongly condemned a strike that hit one of 6 nuclear reactors at Europe's largest nuclear power plant. That plant is sprawled across a large complex in the region of Zaporizhzhia, where it had once been the site of a large-scale battle during an earlier phase of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now it's become the epicenter of a blame game between Russia and Ukraine, as both sides point the finger at the other for the strike that, as the IAEA says, could very well have led to a nuclear meltdown. We'll begin with the Russian side of the story, because at present, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is held under Russian control at the edge of the Dnipro River. From there, a person on the Zaporizhzhia riverbank would stare across the water at Ukrainian-controlled territory, where Ukraine is easily close enough to reach the power plants with all manner of flying weapons if it wished to. According to Russia, the power plant was attacked by multiple military drones sent by Ukraine. One drone hit the dome of one of the plant's nuclear power units, while according to some, but not all Russian reports, another drone hit a site closer to the power plant's canteen, wounding 3 people. According to Russia, no excess radiation was released, and there was no critical damage. Ukraine has since denied the accusations and claimed that it hadn't targeted the power plant at all, but that Russia instead fabricated the attack in order to damage perceptions of its wartime enemy. According to the IAEA, which keeps officials stationed at the plant, its own experts were alerted to the drone strike and corroborated that there had been a detonation at the plant, consistent with what the IAEA would expect to see if indeed a drone was used. Said the organization in a statement after the fact, quoting, "Russian troops engaged what appeared to be an approaching drone. This was followed by an explosion near the reactor building." IAEA head Rafael Mariano Grossi wrote on X that there had been 3 direct hits confirmed against the main reactor containment structures at the power plant. The IAEA has since confirmed that the nuclear safety of the plant was not compromised, but warned that, quote, "This is a serious incident with potential to undermine integrity of the reactor's containment system." At the time of writing this episode, the IAEA has not yet assigned direct blame to any actor for the strikes on the plant. Unsurprisingly, Ukraine has continued to blame Russia for orchestrating the drone strikes in order to frame Ukraine, while Russia has continued to insist that Ukraine was indeed responsible. The plant had previously been immune from attack since November of 2022, although it was seized by Russia shortly after its 2022 invasion of Ukraine kicked off, and it had been the location of fairly intense fighting in the months afterward. It's also been the target of this sort of blame game before, with Russia and Ukraine both accusing each other of planning to attack the plant in July of 2023, something that neither side ever produced evidence to support. Luckily for everybody in that part of the world, the Zaporizhzhia plant has been shut down for a while now, lowering the risk of a meltdown significantly. However, one reactor still needs to be cooled, and they all need to be monitored via other safety systems and personnel in order to ensure that a meltdown won't occur. In the following days, Russia has continued to heap accusations on Ukraine around the plant. On both April the 8th and the 9th, Russia accused Ukraine of launching follow-up drone strikes against the nuclear plant, resulting in damage to the roof of a training center set up on the compound. According to Russian state media, that attack took place just minutes after representatives from the IAEA passed by the location of the strike. Ukraine has again denied responsibility for the incidents, with Ukrainian military and political spokespeople emphasizing that Ukraine would not commit such an attack on a nuclear facility and insisting that Russia has used its control over the plant in order to orchestrate what it sees as propaganda wins. But Russia, never one to let go of a public relations spat, also launched condemnation at the foreign policy chief of the European Union, Joseph Borrell, after Borrell called for a Russian withdrawal from the power plant. One prominent Russian ambassador claimed that the comment, quote, sounds like an encouragement for further Ukrainian attacks. For the record, Borrell also called for a stop to attacks on the power plant as part of the same statement that got Russia all hot under the collar. Of course, we at Warographics can't exactly do our own big reveal on this subject and pull back the curtain to expose whoever was really behind the attack. But what we can do is examine what each side would stand to gain by launching a drone attack on the plant. On the Ukrainian side, it's difficult to pinpoint a precise material reward that such a strike would offer. After all, the plant isn't producing any power, it's not in the direct line of fire for any of the ongoing hostilities in that part of the Zaporizhzhia province, and there's no current indicator from Ukraine or anybody else that Russia might be using the plant as a place to do anything outside the ordinary status quo that's been established there over the past year or so. Nor would a strike on the plant have any utility to Ukraine as a propaganda win. After all, the plant was just hit by drones, and it had basically no effect on Ukrainian morale except to make people a bit more nervous that a nuclear incident might go down. For Russia, though, the reward for staging an attack is somewhat obvious. If they can convince the world that Ukraine is responsible, then they can effectively frame their adversary for launching a highly risky attack that raises real fears of a nuclear incident. A spokesperson for Russia's foreign ministry hit the airwaves in the aftermath, calling on the leaders of world nations to condemn Ukraine for what she called, quote, nuclear terrorism, in what may or may not have been a very heavy-handed attempt to gin up support, but well, it certainly seemed like one. For Russia, creating confusion around a drone strike might also have other tangible benefits. According to Ukraine officials, several people were killed in a wave of strikes and attacks around the same time that Russia was reporting the drone strikes at the nuclear plant. And finally, we've got to account for one more key possibility, that whoever's behind the strikes on the plant may have designs on that portion of the front line for an upcoming military push. If either side is going to make a play around that area of the Dnipro River, again, it's most likely to be Russia. Russia's been launching substantial attacks in that area in recent weeks, and is widely understood to have the initiative at this phase of the war. Recent Ukrainian reports suggest that Russia may be massing up to 100,000 troops in preparation for a major summer push, or otherwise to replenish forces that have been depleted. If Russia were to be planning an attack around that area, then fabricating a Ukrainian drone strike against the Zaporizhzhia plant may serve to test the waters on how NATO and the IAEA feel about fighting there. Nor can we rule out the possibility that Russia may be laying the groundwork for a major act of sabotage there, as it most likely did with Ukraine's Kakhovka Dam in June of last year. Conversely, if Ukraine did indeed launch the strikes on the plant as Russia alleges, it may have been an attempt to probe at a possible weak spot in Russia's air defense, or to force Russian troops to reposition around the plant and draw them away from defensive positions elsewhere. Or, similar to Russia, Ukraine may want to gauge the potential reaction from the international community around acts that might bring the war back in the direction of the nuclear plant. No matter the true nature of the situation, this is one particular flashpoint that we'll be watching very closely in hopes that both Russia and Ukraine leave the plant alone in the future. And from the battlefields of Ukraine, we travel to the nation of Ecuador, where a daring and highly unconventional raid has turned the international order on its head. But although our viewers familiar with Ecuador's recent turmoil might be expecting us to talk about a raid against, or perhaps carried out by, an organized criminal element, this particular raid had a different target: the Mexican embassy. The raid went down on the evening of Friday, April the 5th in the Ecuadorian capital city of Quito, but the diplomatic spat that led to the raid has been going on for far longer. The issue at hand is a disagreement between the Mexican government, led by President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, or AMLO, and the Ecuadorian government, led by President Daniel Noboa. The subject of that disagreement is former Ecuadorian Vice President Jorge Glass. He had been implicated, then convicted, then imprisoned as part of something called the Odebrecht scandal, which we're not going to get into right now, other than to say that Glass was ultimately found guilty of having taken over $13.5 million worth of bribes. Glass has been in prison for a while and then let out on parole, and on December 17, 2023, he walked into the Mexican embassy in Quito and asked for asylum. Since then, he's been staying at the embassy, and the question of whether Mexico will grant him asylum has become a very sore subject for both countries. As relations have devolved, Mexican President AMLO has accused Ecuadorian President Noboa of having taken advantage of the assassination of a political rival in order to be elected, while Ecuador has slapped additional charges onto Glass in an attempt to get him out. The day before the raid, Ecuador effectively ordered Mexico's ambassador to leave the country. On April 5th, however, things came to a head. Rumors had been building that Glass was about to be granted asylum, and in response, Ecuador had surrounded the embassy with security forces. On that night, Glass was granted asylum, and right on cue, Ecuadorian forces in riot gear scaled the exterior walls, stormed the embassy, and took Glass into custody. Mexican officials at the embassy did what they could to delay the security forces, even at times physically trying to stop them, but there was no such luck. Glass was spirited away by the forces present, while embassy staff were left reeling in the aftermath. Noboa quickly defended his decision to the international press, explaining that because of Ecuador's ongoing security crisis, which we've covered extensively in prior episodes, it was imperative that such a high-profile Ecuadorian criminal not be allowed to leave the country. That justification, though, is falling on deaf ears. To say that Mexico is livid in response to the incident would be a serious understatement. Since the debacle went down, Mexico has broken off its diplomatic relationship with Ecuador and led the charge among many Latin American and global nations to condemn Ecuador's actions as a flagrant violation of international accords and diplomatic conventions. Meanwhile, Mexico's authorities in and around the embassy were deeply shaken by the incident, with their recorded statements seeming to indicate that they genuinely feared for Glass's life. Said OAD official Roberto Canseco on a recording taken during or after the raid, quote, "This is not possible. This is madness. I'm worried because they might kill him." Upon arrival in Mexico, the now ex-ambassador told reporters that the Noboa government, quote, "improvises and is alien to the art of politics and the importance of asylum to Mexico and Ecuador." This from a representative of one nation that's offered refuge to figures from Leon Trotsky to the Shah of Iran, speaking to another nation that spent years giving Julian Assange asylum in London. In the aftermath, Mexico's diplomats and embassy staff have made it safely home, shaken up, but otherwise all right. But for Quito, the rest of the world isn't just mad, it's enraged, with Mexico now planning to bring the incident before The Hague. Nations all across the globe have made their ire known, from Western allied countries like the US and the European Union to many of their traditional adversaries, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and more. No matter what else, these sorts of raids on embassies are extremely unusual. Embassies on foreign soil are considered to be the sovereign territory of the nation they represent, and norms and expectations around how the international community handles embassies are among the most rigid and universally agreed on in the world. They are meant to be places of sanctuary, where a host country's security forces cannot go without permission from the embassy's diplomatic staff, and that convention is one that gets broken exceptionally rarely. Yet even this wasn't the only embassy attack of recent weeks. While not striking an embassy building per se, Israel has been roundly condemned on suspicion of launching an airstrike on a consular building on Iran's embassy compound in Syria and killing several top Iranian generals. For two major embassy-centered debacles to go down within weeks of each other is extraordinary, and Ecuador's Noboa administration is likely to suffer a gargantuan black eye from the international community as a lasting repercussion of their raid last week. And moving on, we travel to the nation of Sudan, where basically, on a technicality, we can bring you at least a shred of good news. On Friday, April the 5th, the United Nations announced that it had begun to distribute desperately needed food aid in the western Sudanese region of Darfur, the same area that had been rocked by horrific violence in the last year and in decades past. At the time of writing, some 18 million people in Sudan, or 1/3 of the country's population, face acute hunger, with 5 million on the brink of starvation, as counted by the World Food Programme under the UN. Darfur, in particular, is in desperate need of relief, and with this most recent announcement by the UN, at least a portion of that relief has now arrived. But despite the news that they've been able to bring temporary respite, the UN has been transparent about the reality of the situation in Darfur, and specifically that these shipments of aid will not be enough. Sudan faces its annual lean season in the next few weeks when food supplies from the last harvest run out, and there's still a long time to go before the next harvest is ready. Nor are these current convoys enough to address the hunger crisis at large scale, even for a short time. The aid that's been shipped in so far can sustain about 250,000 people for no more than a month. That amounts to feeding 1 in 20 Sudanese people who are currently on the brink of starvation and 1 in 72 who are facing hunger. In fact, the figure is barely enough to address just the subset of Sudanese children who the UN assesses to be at imminent risk of death by malnutrition in the coming months, some 222,000 in total. Making matters worse, the UN knows just how much money it needs to fix the problem, a sum of $2.7 billion American dollars. So far, it's raised just 5% of that according to last month's figures. So, while we can bring at least a shred of good news about Sudan, for now, that's precisely what it is, a tiny shred of hope amidst a hell of a lot of darkness, starvation, and ruin. At present, Sudan's civil war is getting worse, not better, with tens of millions of people in the line of fire as the Sudanese government and the paramilitary rapid support forces continue to battle it out and determine just who will lead Sudan into the future. But it's still worth drawing light to the fact that this desperately needed aid has started to arrive. It can make its way to the places where it's needed most, even despite the war, and hopefully more of that aid can arrive soon. With any luck, the news that some food has made it into Sudan can be a wake-up call for an international community consumed by the incredibly difficult task of getting food aid into Gaza. They will know that elsewhere, unbelievable numbers of people are on the brink and could very well have their lives saved by that very same food that's currently unable to make its way to Gaza mouths. And finally, we turn to the ranks of the Russian paramilitary Wagner group, but not on the front lines of the Ukraine war, where official Wagner units have been absent for some time. Instead, we find Wagner in the Central African Republic, where the Associated Press has reported that the organization is filling its ranks with veteran rebels from the nation's civil conflicts. That recruitment drive isn't on the scale of ones and twos, it's on the scale of hundreds or maybe even thousands on a continent where Wagner appears to be finding its footing for the long term. In the Central African Republic, some 5,000 ex-rebel fighters have laid down their arms in the span of the last decade as part of a nationwide program meant to escort rebel soldiers back toward peaceful society. Program participants get bi-weekly stipends and job training in order to make a life after fighting. Or they can join the country's security forces if they so choose. In exchange, they must leave a gun or a large amount of ammunition to be confiscated. But as the AP explains, reality often doesn't align with the starry-eyed ambition of the program, and these ex-fighters are frequently ostracized by their families and communities, hunted down by people looking to settle scores, and forced to accept unemployment or menial work in a place where few real job opportunities exist. What that means is that these thousands of fighters have a known and particularly violent skill set, but no employers, no community to fall back on, and nowhere else to go, just as the Central African Republic becomes the de facto capital of the Wagner Group's operations in Africa. Now, we've spoken extensively about Wagner on this channel, but in Africa, the mercenary group plays a few key roles. They take part in active conflicts across the country, sometimes by fighting directly and sometimes by working as advisors and trainers. They protect resource depots like copper, gold, and diamond mines, and they patrol oil fields, forests of lumberwood, and other valuable resources that can, in some way, bring a profit back to Russia. And they prop up regimes across the continent, often quite violently, in exchange for the latitude to do what they want when they want with those host nations' resources and people. In the Central African Republic, thousands of Wagner fighters live and work, helping to fight rebels, build up local militias, and exploit the country's mines and forests, all with a hearty helping of human rights abuses to go along with it. Now, the Central African Republic's ex-rebels are proving to be a fruitful recruiting pool for the Wagner Group. They come with the knowledge and initiative to be able to work as effective foot soldiers basically from day one, and they're relatively easy to train in tactical matters and hone into elite combatants. We've got to emphasize here that numbers are notoriously hard to come by on this subject, but the rough estimates are not encouraging. According to the Central African Republic, up to 15% of participants in the country's rebel disarmament program go on to rejoin armed groups, but according to the UN, which takes part in the program, up to 70% of participants eventually fall off their radar, with no indicator, positive or negative, about where they might end up afterward. With a large number of ex-rebels waiting to take part in a limited number of vocational courses, our waiting periods have gotten longer and longer, during which time those people have few connections and stick out like a sore thumb as they try to get by in whatever communities now host them. That makes them prime targets for Wagner and its recruiters, especially now that other ex-rebels have joined their cause and know precisely where to look to find people like themselves. On the one hand, the new rush of unspecified number of fighters to the Wagner ranks is a development that the Central African Republic's government in Bangui likely takes quite positively. Wagner operates with near impunity in the country, doing as they please, when they please, and in exchange, they ensure that the country's ruling elite are not challenged or pushed out. More fighters for Wagner means more stability for them. But on the other hand, this massive influx of new recruits also fixes a problem that Wagner was expected to start dealing with, namely a lack of new recruits from Russia and ex-Soviet nations now that they're effectively barred from operating independently in Russia itself. Now, with Wagner making a new life for itself on the African continent, it soaks up a growing number of African recruits who can carry on that same mission, dramatically expanding the organization's manpower with people who have a lot of relevant expertise and very few alternatives. It's a recipe for expansion, and Wagner seems to know it. According to experts interviewed by the AP, Wagner is able to handpick its favored recruits from the ranks of the ex-rebels who chose to join the country's national army, while former fighters who don't join the military attest that they're recruited on the side. And all this as Wagner begins to expand into an African market for their services that may well prove to be extraordinarily lucrative. Across the continent, from the military juntas of the Sahel to the perpetual war zones of Somalia, Sudan, and the Congo to kleptocracies like Angola and Equatorial Guinea, there are a whole lot of dictators and warlords who would be happy to exchange coin or resources for Wagner's protection. According to the BBC, Russian military intelligence has taken to offering a, quote, regime survival package to African nations, providing military assistance, political experts, and economic protections in exchange for resources, and it's widely understood that Wagner is the organization that'll handle those efforts in person. Now, with the dramatic influx of new recruits hailing from the continent itself, Wagner is in a position to corner the market with Russia's dictator protection racket in a prospect that should raise very real concerns for the entire rest of the world.